The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Balmoral Castle as Camilla, queen consort, made her way toward the royal garage. She had always been particular about her transportation, but today something different caught her eye. Parked between the usual collection of royal vehicles sat the late Queen Elizabeth II personal Range Rover, a deep green beast of a machine that had been the Queen's preferred choice for her Scottish estate adventures. The vehicle held memories that seemed to emanate from its very metal frame. This wasn't just any car. It was the Queen's sanctuary on wheels, where she had spent countless hours driving through the Scottish Highlands, often without security, enjoying the simple pleasure of being behind the wheel. The Range Rover had been specially modified to her preferences, with a lower seat to accommodate her height, and subtle adjustments that made it uniquely hers. Camilla approached the vehicle slowly, running her fingers along its pristine exterior. The paintwork gleamed despite the vehicle's age, maintained to perfection by the royal staff even after the Queen's passing. She could almost sense the presence of her late mother-in-law, the woman who had become such a significant figure in her life, especially during the later years when their relationship had evolved from cautious formality to genuine warmth. The decision to take the Range Rover wasn't made lightly. Camilla had been thinking about it for weeks, ever since she had learned that the vehicle sat and used in the garage, almost like a shrine to the late Queen. She felt a strange pull toward it, as if the Queen herself was somehow calling her to continue the tradition of Highland drives that had brought Elizabeth so much joy during her final years. As she opened the driver's door, the familiar scent of leather mixed with a subtle hint of the Queen's preferred lavender perfume still lingered in the cabin. The interior was immaculate, everything exactly as the Queen had left it. Her reading glasses still sat in the center console, and a small tartan blanket was folded neatly in the back seat. These personal touches made Camilla pause, wondering if she was overstepping some invisible boundary. The royal household had been in a delicate state of transition since the Queen's passing. Everyone was trying to navigate the new reality while honoring the memory and traditions of the woman who had been the steady center of their world for over 70 years. Vehicles, personal belongings, and even rooms remained largely untouched, creating an atmosphere where the past and present seemed to coexist in an uncomfortable balance. Camilla settled into the driver's seat, adjusting it slightly to accommodate her own frame. The leather was soft and worn in places where the Queen's hands had gripped the steering wheel during countless drives. As she started the engine, it purred to life with the quiet power that had made this particular Range Rover the Queen's favorite among all her vehicles. The drive through the Balmoral estate was initially peaceful. Camilla found herself following the same routes she had often seen the Queen take, winding through the heather-covered hills and past the streams that sparkled in the morning light. There was something deeply therapeutic about being in this space, connected to the land in the same way the Queen had been, using the same vehicle that had provided her with such comfort and freedom. However, as she drove deeper into the estate, Camilla began to notice something troubling. The radio crackled with hushed conversations between security personnel, and she could sense a growing tension in the usually calm atmosphere of the Highland retreat. The Queen's former protection officer, Sergeant Major William Harrison, had been with the royal family for over 20 years and had developed an almost paternal relationship with the late Queen's possessions and routines. Harrison had arrived at the garage that morning to perform his weekly inspection of the Queen's vehicle, a ritual he had maintained religiously since her passing. When he discovered the Range Rover missing from its usual spot, his initial concern quickly transformed into something much more intense. This wasn't just about protocol or security. It was deeply personal for a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the Queen and preserving her memory. The Sergeant Major's relationship with the royal family was complex, built on decades of loyalty and an almost mystical devotion to duty that went far beyond his official responsibilities. He had been present during some of the Queen's most private moments, had shared quiet conversations during long drives, and had become one of the few people who truly understood the depth of her connection to Balmoral and its surroundings. When Harrison learned that Camilla had taken the vehicle without informing the security detail, his reaction was swift and decisive. He immediately contacted the control room, his voice tight, with barely controlled emotion as he reported the situation. To him, this wasn't simply about transportation or protocol. It felt like a violation of something sacred, a disruption of the careful balance that had been maintained to honor the Queen's memory. The radio communications that followed were tense and professional, but those who knew Harrison could hear the underlying current of anger in his measured words. He had served the crown faithfully for decades, and, in his mind, certain things were simply not to be touched, not to be altered, not to be claimed by anyone other than the person for whom they had been intended. Camilla, meanwhile, continued her drive, unaware of the storm brewing back at the castle. She had found a quiet spot overlooking a glen where she knew the queen used to stop and simply sit, enjoying the solitude and the magnificent views that stretched for miles across the Scottish landscape. The Range Rover felt comfortable beneath her, and, for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that she was carrying on a tradition rather than disrupting one. The peace was broken by the sound of approaching vehicles. Two black SUVs appeared on the horizon, moving faster than was typical for the usually sedate pace of life on the estate. Camilla recognized them immediately as security vehicles, and she felt her stomach tighten as she realized that her impromptu drive had somehow caused a significant disturbance. Harrison was in the lead vehicle, his face a mask of professional composure that barely concealed his emotional state. When the convoy reached Camilla's location, he stepped out with the precise movements of a man accustomed to military protocol, but his eyes betrayed a fury that surprised everyone present, including Camilla herself. The confrontation that followed would be talked about in royal circles for months to come. Harrison approached the Range Rover with a deliberate slowness that made his anger all the more apparent. His words, when they came, were measured and respectful on the surface, but carried an undercurrent of accusation that cut through the Highland air like a blade. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice steady but strained, "this vehicle was not cleared for use. Security protocols require advance notification for any changes to transportation arrangements, particularly involving vehicles with special significance." The formal language couldn't mask the personal nature of his objection, and everyone present understood that this was about much more than protocol. Camilla had expected some resistance to her decision, but the intensity of Harrison's reaction caught her off guard. She had been queen consort for months now, and while she understood the importance of protocol, she hadn't anticipated that her choice to drive the late queen's vehicle would provoke such a strong response from someone she had always considered to be a loyal member of the household staff. The conversation that followed was tense and carefully worded, with both parties trying to maintain the appearance of civility while addressing what had become a deeply personal disagreement. Harrison's position was clear. The queen's personal belongings, especially something as intimate as her favorite vehicle, should remain untouched as a mark of respect and remembrance. Camilla's perspective was different. She saw her decision as a way of honoring the queen's memory by continuing to use something that had brought her joy, rather than allowing it to sit and used as a static memorial. She believed that the queen herself would have preferred her possessions to be used and appreciated rather than preserved like museum pieces. The other security personnel stood at a respectful distance, uncomfortable witnesses to a confrontation that touched on issues of authority, respect, and the complex dynamics of grief within the royal household. Some sympathized with Harrison's position, understanding his deep emotional connection to the queen and his role as guardian of her memory. Others felt that Camilla, as the new queen consort, had every right to use any vehicle in the royal fleet. As the tension escalated, it became clear that this was about more than just a car or even protocol. It represented the broader challenges facing the royal family as they navigated the transition from one era to another, trying to honor the past while moving forward into an uncertain future. Harrison's final words before retreating to his vehicle carried a weight that surprised everyone. "Some things, Your Majesty, are not ours to claim. They belong to memory, and memory deserves its sanctuary." With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, leaving Camilla alone with the Range Rover and the stunning Scottish landscape that suddenly felt much less welcoming than it had just moments before. The drive back to Balmoral Castle was quiet and contemplative. Camilla found herself questioning not just her decision to take the vehicle, but the broader implications of her role as queen consort and the delicate balance between honoring the past and establishing her own place within the royal tradition. The Range Rover, which had felt like a connection to the late queen just hours earlier, now seemed heavy with the weight of unresolved emotions and competing loyalties. The incident would prove to be just the beginning of a series of confrontations that would test the relationships within the royal household and force everyone involved to confront their own assumptions about duty, respect, and the meaning of service to the crown. What had started as a simple drive through the Scottish Highlands had evolved into something much larger and more complex, touching on fundamental questions about tradition, change, and the price of progress within one of the world's most traditional institutions. The news of the confrontation spread through Balmoral Castle like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations in corridors and coded communications between staff members who had served the royal family for decades. By evening, everyone from the head housekeeper to the youngest footman knew that something significant had occurred between the Queen Consort and Sergeant Major Harrison, though the exact details remained shrouded in the kind of discretion that the royal household had perfected over centuries. King Charles was informed of the incident within hours of its occurrence. He received the news while reviewing official papers in his private study, a room that still bore many traces of his mother's influence and taste. The king's reaction was complex, reflecting the difficult position he found himself in as both a son still grieving his mother and a monarch trying to establish his own reign while respecting the legacy of his predecessor. Charles had always been acutely aware of the delicate dynamics within his household, particularly when it came to his wife's integration into royal life. Camilla's journey to acceptance within the royal family and by the British public had been long and sometimes difficult, marked by challenges that required both patience and careful navigation. The incident with the Range Rover represented exactly the kind of situation he had hoped to avoid during this sensitive transitional period. The king's relationship with Harrison was built on years of mutual respect and shared devotion to Queen Elizabeth. Harrison had been more than just a protection officer. He had been a confidant and companion to the late Queen during some of her most private moments. Charles understood that the Sergeant Major's reaction came from a place of genuine love and loyalty, making the situation all the more delicate to handle. Meanwhile, Harrison retreated to his quarters that evening, struggling with emotions that he rarely allowed himself to express. His small apartment within the castle complex was sparse and functional, decorated only with a few photographs from his years of service and commendations that reflected his distinguished career. That night, he sat in his favorite chair, staring at a photograph of the Queen taken during one of their drives through the estate. Her face lit up with the genuine joy she found in these simple moments of freedom. The photograph captured something that few people ever saw. The Queen as simply a woman who loved the Scottish countryside, who found peace in driving her own vehicle through landscapes that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Harrison remembered the conversation they had shared that day, discussing everything from estate management to her concerns about the future of the monarchy. These moments had made him feel less like an employee and more like a trusted friend, a role he treasured above all his official duties. Harrison's anger wasn't really about protocol or even about respect for hierarchy. It was about the fear that these precious memories were being carelessly handled, that the intimate connections between the Queen and the places and objects she loved were being treated as mere possessions to be redistributed rather than sacred trusts to be preserved. In his mind, allowing Camilla to simply take the Range Rover without understanding its significance was like allowing someone to rewrite history without understanding what was being lost in the process. The Sergeant Major had served in conflicts around the world before joining the Royal Protection Unit, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional complexity of his current situation. He was trained to protect people and property, but how do you protect memories? How do you guard against the erosion of something as intangible as the spirit of a place or the significance of a simple drive through familiar countryside? As word of the confrontation reached other members of the extended royal household, reactions were mixed and often reflected deeper tensions about change and continuity within the monarchy. Some of the longer-serving staff members sympathized with Harrison's position, feeling that the Queen's personal belongings should be treated with special reverence during this period of mourning and adjustment. Lady Margaret Thornbury, who had served as one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting for over 30 years, was particularly vocal in her support for Harrison's stance. She had witnessed firsthand the Queen's deep attachment to the Range Rover and understood that it represented far more than transportation. During their private conversations, Lady Margaret argued that there were certain boundaries that should be observed, certain aspects of the late Queen's life that should remain untouched as a mark of respect and remembrance. However, other members of the household took a different view. Private Secretary James Morrison, a younger man who had joined the royal staff during the final years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, believed that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to adapt and evolve. In his opinion, keeping the Queen's possessions as untouchable shrines would ultimately serve no one, and might even dishonor her memory by suggesting that life had stopped with her passing. Morrison had observed the royal family's struggles with modernization over the years and believed that Camilla's decision to use the Range Rover actually showed a healthy approach to moving forward while maintaining connections to the past. He saw the confrontation with Harrison as representative of the broader challenges facing the monarchy as it tried to balance tradition with the practical needs of a living, functioning institution. The divide among the staff reflected deeper questions about the nature of royal service and the proper way to honor the memory of someone who had been both sovereign and, to many, a beloved maternal figure. Some felt that preservation was paramount, that maintaining everything exactly as the Queen had left it was the highest form of tribute they could offer. Others believed that she would have wanted life to continue, for her possessions to be used and appreciated rather than turned into static monuments. Camilla herself spent the evening walking through the castle's corridors, reflecting on the unexpected intensity of the day's events. She had always known that her position came with unique challenges, but the confrontation with Harrison had revealed depths of feeling and loyalty within the household that she hadn't fully appreciated. The Range Rover now seemed less like a vehicle and more like a symbol of all the complex emotions surrounding her role as Queen Consort. In her private apartment, Camilla called her close friend and confidant, Annabelle Elliott, to discuss the situation. Their conversation stretched late into the night, covering not just the immediate incident, but the broader challenges of establishing her place within an institution that valued tradition above almost everything else. Annabelle, who had known Camilla for decades and had watched her navigate the complexities of royal life, offered both support and practical advice about managing the delicate relationships that defined her daily existence. The conversation helped Camilla understand that her decision, while well-intentioned, had touched on something much deeper than she had realized. The Range Rover wasn't just the Queen's favorite vehicle. It was a tangible connection to a woman who had shaped the lives and loyalties of everyone around her for over 70 years. Taking it without understanding its significance, even as Queen Consort, could be seen as dismissive of those relationships and the grief that still permeated the household. At the same time, Camilla struggled with the feeling that she was being held to impossible standards, expected to somehow know and respect every nuance of the Queen's preferences and relationships without having been fully part of that inner circle during the most formative years. She had come to love and respect her mother-in-law deeply, but their relationship had developed relatively late, and there were aspects of the Queen's life and attachments that remained mysterious to her. King Charles found himself in an increasingly difficult position as reports and opinions reached him from various members of his household. He understood Harrison's perspective and respected the depth of feeling that had motivated his reaction, but he also needed to support his wife and establish clear lines of authority within his own reign. The situation required a delicate balance between honoring the past and moving forward, between respecting grief and maintaining functionality. The king decided to postpone any immediate action, hoping that emotions would cool and that a solution might emerge naturally. However, he also began to realize that this incident might be symptomatic of larger issues that would need to be addressed as his reign continued to evolve. The question of how to honor his mother's memory while allowing his own family to function normally was one that would likely arise in various forms throughout the years ahead. Harrison, meanwhile, began to receive support from unexpected quarters. Several retired members of the Royal Protection Unit reached out to him privately, expressing their understanding of his position and their own concerns about the handling of the Queen's legacy. These conversations reinforced his belief that he had acted correctly, even if his methods had been more confrontational than usual. Among these supporters was Colonel David Hartwell, who had served as head of Royal Protection during some of the most challenging years of the Queen's reign. Hartwell's perspective carried particular weight because he had been instrumental in developing many of the protocols that governed the security and treatment of royal property. His support for Harrison's position added a layer of institutional legitimacy to what might otherwise have been dismissed as an emotional overreaction. The colonel's involvement also raised the stakes of the conflict, transforming it from a simple disagreement between a staff member and the Queen Consort into something that touched on fundamental questions about the continuity of royal traditions and the proper treatment of the late Queen's legacy. His quiet conversations with other senior staff members began to create a network of support for Harrison's position that would prove difficult for the royal family to ignore. As the second day after the incident dawned, it became clear that the situation was not going to resolve itself quietly. The emotions involved were too deep, the positions too entrenched, and the symbolic significance too great for a simple apology or explanation to suffice. What had begun as an innocent drive through the Scottish Highlands was evolving into a test of wills that would require careful handling to prevent lasting damage to relationships within the royal household. The Range Rover itself sat in the garage, now returned to its usual place, but somehow changed by the events of the previous day. Staff members walked past it differently, more aware of its significance and the emotions it could provoke. Some avoided looking at it altogether, while others paused to study it as if seeing it for the first time, trying to understand how a simple vehicle could become the center of such intense feelings and complex loyalties. The incident had revealed fault lines within the royal household that ran much deeper than anyone had realized, touching on fundamental questions about change, respect, and the proper way to honor the memory of someone who had been the center of their world for so long. As the sun set over Balmoral Castle for the second time since the confrontation, everyone involved knew that they were facing a crisis that would require wisdom, patience, and perhaps some painful compromises to resolve. The third morning after the Range Rover incident brought an unexpected development that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. Prince William and Catherine arrived at Balmoral Castle unannounced, having driven through the night from their home in Windsor. Their sudden appearance caught everyone by surprise, including King Charles, who had not been informed of their decision to make the journey to Scotland. William's relationship with the castle and its surroundings was deeply personal, shaped by countless childhood memories and, more recently, by the profound grief of losing his grandmother in this very place. He had inherited much of the Queen's love for Balmoral, understanding intuitively why she had considered it her true home rather than any of the more famous royal residences. The thought that conflict was brewing in this sanctuary disturbed him in ways that went beyond simple family loyalty. Catherine, meanwhile, brought a different perspective to the situation. As someone who had married into the royal family rather than being born into it, she understood many of the challenges that Camilla faced in navigating the complex traditions and unwritten rules that governed royal life. Her own journey to acceptance had been smoother in many ways, but she remembered the feeling of being constantly watched and judged, of having her every action scrutinized for proper adherence to protocols she was still learning. The couple's arrival created an immediate shift in the atmosphere at Balmoral. Staff members who had been walking on eggshells for 3 days suddenly found themselves dealing with additional royal presences, each bringing their own perspectives and expectations. The tension that had been building since the confrontation with Harrison now had to accommodate new voices and potentially new solutions. William's first action was to seek out Sergeant Major Harrison privately. The two men met in the small office that Harrison maintained within the castle's security complex, a space that was functional rather than comfortable, filled with monitors, communications equipment, and the various tools of his trade. The conversation that followed was unlike any that Harrison had experienced during his years of service. Prince William began by acknowledging Harrison's decades of faithful service to his grandmother, recognizing explicitly the personal nature of the Sergeant Major's relationship with the late Queen. This acknowledgement meant more to Harrison than any formal commendation could have, because it came from someone who truly understood the depth of the bond that had existed between the Queen and her most trusted staff members. However, William also gently challenged Harrison's approach to the situation. The prince understood the emotional motivations behind the confrontation with Camilla, but he questioned whether such a direct challenge to the Queen Consort's authority was ultimately in anyone's best interest, including the memory of his grandmother. William suggested that there might be better ways to honor the Queen's legacy while also allowing the monarchy to function effectively under the new reign. Harrison found himself in the unusual position of being counseled by someone he had watched grow from childhood into the future king. William's words carried weight not just because of his position, but because of his obvious genuine concern for all parties involved. The prince made it clear that he respected Harrison's motives while questioning his methods, opening the door for a more constructive approach to resolving the conflict. Meanwhile, Catherine sought out Camilla for their own private conversation. The two women met in the morning room that had been one of the Queen's favorite spaces for informal meetings, surrounded by photographs and mementos that reflected decades of royal family life. The setting itself seemed to encourage honest conversation about the challenges of royal life and the expectations that came with their positions. Catherine's approach was both supportive and practical. She acknowledged that Camilla's decision to drive the Range Rover was understandable and probably well-intentioned, while also helping her understand why it had provoked such a strong reaction from Harrison and others within the household. Their conversation touched on the broader challenges of being a royal spouse, the constant need to balance personal inclinations with institutional expectations. The discussion revealed how much both women had learned about the invisible rules that governed royal behavior, rules that were often discovered only when they were inadvertently broken. Catherine shared her own experiences of making mistakes during her early years as a royal, describing the learning process as sometimes painful but ultimately valuable in developing the sensitivity required for their roles. Camilla found great comfort in Catherine's understanding and support. The younger woman's perspective helped her see the Range Rover incident not as a personal failure, but as a natural part of the complex process of establishing her place within an institution that had been shaped by traditions spanning centuries. Catherine's advice was practical and based on hard-won experience. Sometimes the most important thing was not to be right, but to find ways to move forward that honored everyone's feelings and maintained the relationships that made royal life possible. King Charles was both relieved and slightly concerned by his son and daughter-in-law's unexpected intervention. While he welcomed their support and fresh perspectives, he was also aware that their involvement elevated the significance of what might have remained a relatively private disagreement. The presence of the future king and queen at Balmoral to address this situation sent a clear message about how seriously the family was taking the conflict. The king decided to convene a family meeting that evening, bringing together all the principal parties to discuss the situation openly and seek a resolution that could satisfy everyone involved. This decision represented a departure from the usual royal approach of handling such matters through private conversations and indirect communications, but Charles felt that the situation required a more direct approach. The meeting took place in the Queen's former sitting room, a space that felt heavy with memory and significance. Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine gathered around the same table where the Queen had hosted countless informal family discussions over the years. The irony of using this particular room to discuss the aftermath of taking her vehicle was not lost on anyone present. Charles opened the discussion by acknowledging the difficulty of the situation and the legitimate concerns that had been raised by all parties. He emphasized his understanding of Harrison's devotion to his mother's memory, while also making clear that Camilla's position as queen consort entitled her to certain considerations and respect. The challenge, he suggested, was finding a way to honor both the past and the present without sacrificing either. William contributed his perspective on the importance of maintaining harmony within the royal household, particularly during this period of transition. He argued that public perception of the monarchy depended heavily on the impression that the royal family was united and functioning smoothly, and that internal conflicts, however understandable, could potentially damage that impression if they became widely known. Catherine focused on the practical aspects of the situation, suggesting that clear protocols needed to be established for the handling of the late Queen's personal possessions. She pointed out that this incident had revealed a gap in planning that could easily lead to similar conflicts in the future if not addressed thoughtfully. Her approach was characteristically practical and forward-looking, focused on preventing future problems rather than just resolving the current one. Camilla used the opportunity to explain her perspective more fully than she had been able to do during the confrontation with Harrison. She described her desire to feel connected to the late Queen's memory and her belief that using the Range Rover was a way of honoring that memory rather than disrespecting it. She also acknowledged that she should have been more sensitive to the feelings of staff members who had such close personal relationships with the Queen. The family discussion continued for several hours, touching on broader themes about the nature of royal service, the proper treatment of the Queen's legacy, and the practical challenges of managing the transition to a new reign. While no immediate solutions emerged, the conversation helped everyone understand the different perspectives involved and the depth of feeling on all sides. By the end of the meeting, several key principles had emerged that would guide their approach to resolving the conflict. First, there was universal agreement that Sergeant Major Harrison's devotion to the late Queen was admirable and should be respected, even when his methods might be questioned. Second, everyone acknowledged that Camilla's position as queen consort required a certain level of deference and support from the household staff. Most importantly, the family agreed that the situation called for a solution that could honor both Harrison's concerns about preserving the Queen's memory and Camilla's legitimate needs as a member of the working royal family. This would require creativity and compromise from all parties, but The foundation for such a solution had been established through the evening's honest conversation. The meeting concluded with Charles taking responsibility for developing a specific plan to address the immediate conflict while also establishing clearer guidelines for similar situations in the future. William and Catherine agreed to remain at Balmoral for several more days to help facilitate whatever conversations might be necessary to implement such a plan. As the family members retired to their respective quarters that night, there was a sense that progress had been made, even though many details remained to be worked out. The Range Rover still sat in the garage, but it no longer seemed like an insurmountable obstacle to harmony within the royal household. Instead, it had become a symbol of the challenges and opportunities inherent in balancing tradition with progress, memory with practicality, and personal feelings with institutional needs. The incident had revealed the complexity of emotions and loyalties that existed within the royal household, but it had also demonstrated the family's ability to address difficult situations with honesty and mutual respect. The process of resolution would require continued effort and sensitivity from everyone involved, but the foundation for such resolution had been established through patient conversation and genuine care for all parties' concerns. Harrison, though not present at the family meeting, was aware that discussions were taking place about the situation. His own conflicted feelings continued to evolve as he reflected on Prince William's earlier conversation and the broader implications of his confrontation with the Queen Consort. The next phase of this unusual crisis would test everyone's ability to find common ground while maintaining the dignity and respect that had always characterized the best traditions of royal service. The fourth day brought a development that no one could have anticipated. While the royal family continued their discussions about resolving the Range Rover conflict, a discovery was made that would change everyone's understanding of the situation completely. Maria Santos, the Queen's former personal maid who had served her for over 15 years, approached King Charles with information that she felt compelled to share given the ongoing tensions. Maria had been one of the most trusted members of the Queen's household, responsible not only for her personal care but also for maintaining the private spaces where the Queen felt most comfortable. Her relationship with the late monarch had evolved from professional service to genuine affection, and she possessed insights into the Queen's thoughts and feelings that few others shared. What she revealed to Charles that morning would transform the entire discussion about the Range Rover and its significance. According to Maria, the Queen had specifically mentioned Camilla in connection with the Range Rover during her final months. In several private conversations, the Queen had expressed hope that Camilla would eventually feel comfortable enough to use her personal vehicle, seeing it as a sign that her daughter-in-law had truly embraced life at Balmoral. The Queen had apparently worried that Camilla sometimes felt like an outsider in the Scottish retreat and had hoped that sharing some of her favorite aspects of life there might help bridge any remaining distance. This revelation struck everyone who heard it like a thunderbolt. The vehicle that had become a source of conflict had actually been intended by the Queen as a gift of sorts, a way of welcoming Camilla more fully into the traditions and pleasures that had made Balmoral so special. The irony was profound. Harrison's attempt to protect the Queen's memory had actually worked against her explicit wishes regarding the very person he had confronted. Maria's information included specific details that left no doubt about the authenticity of her account. She described how the Queen had asked her to ensure that the Range Rover was kept in perfect condition, not as a museum piece, but so that it would be ready when Camilla felt ready to use it. The Queen had even mentioned specific routes through the estate that she thought Camilla might enjoy, places where the views were particularly spectacular and where the driving was pleasant and peaceful. The personal maid also revealed that the Queen had been working on a letter to Camilla about the Range Rover, though she had never finished it due to her declining health in the final weeks. Maria had found the draft among the Queen's personal papers but had hesitated to share it during the initial period of mourning, thinking it might cause additional emotional pain. However, given the current situation, she felt that the Queen's intentions needed to be known. King Charles read the incomplete letter with tears in his eyes, recognizing his mother's distinctive handwriting and her characteristically thoughtful approach to family relationships. The letter expressed warmth and affection for Camilla, along with specific encouragement to make herself at home in all aspects of life at Balmoral. The Queen had written about her hope that Camilla would discover the same joy in driving through the Highland landscape that had sustained her through so many years of stress and responsibility. The letter also contained insights into the Queen's broader thinking about the future of the monarchy and her hopes for how traditions might evolve under Charles's reign. She had written about the importance of continuity balanced with adaptation, of preserving what was valuable while allowing for growth and change. Her comments about the Range Rover were clearly part of this larger vision for how the royal family might honor the past while embracing the future. Armed with this new information, Charles immediately sought out Sergeant Major Harrison for a private conversation. The meeting took place in the same garden where the Queen used to walk each morning, a setting that seemed appropriate for a discussion about her true wishes and intentions. Charles approached the conversation with both firmness and compassion, understanding that Harrison's reaction to the new information would be complex and potentially painful. When Charles shared Maria's revelations and showed Harrison portions of the Queen's unfinished letter, the Sergeant Major's response was immediate and profound. The color drained from his face as he realized that his passionate defense of the Queen's memory had actually contradicted her explicit wishes. The man who had prided himself on understanding and protecting what the Queen valued most had somehow completely misread the situation. Harrison's emotional response was intense and immediate. Years of military training and professional composure crumbled as he confronted the reality that his actions had not honored the Queen's memory, but had actually betrayed it. The discovery that she had specifically wanted Camilla to use the Range Rover made his confrontational behavior seem not just inappropriate, but actively harmful to the goals the Queen had hoped to achieve. The Sergeant Major's distress was so apparent that Charles felt compelled to provide immediate reassurance and support. The king emphasized that Harrison's mistake was understandable given the incomplete information he had been working with, and that his motives had been honorable even if his actions had been misguided. Charles made it clear that no blame was being assigned, and that the focus should be on moving forward in a way that would truly honor the Queen's wishes. However, Harrison's sense of professional and personal failure ran deep. He had built his entire identity around his ability to understand and protect what the Queen valued, and the discovery that he had so completely misunderstood her intentions regarding something as important as her relationship with Camilla was devastating to his self-perception. He immediately asked to speak with Camilla personally to offer both an explanation and an apology. The conversation between Harrison and Camilla took place later that same day in the Queen's former morning room, with King Charles present as both witness and mediator. Harrison's approach was formal and deeply remorseful, beginning with a full acknowledgement of his error and a sincere apology for his behavior during their confrontation. His words were carefully chosen but clearly heartfelt, reflecting both his military background and his genuine distress at having acted contrary to the Queen's wishes. Camilla's response revealed much about her character and her understanding of the complex dynamics at play within the royal household. Rather than accepting Harrison's apology with simple graciousness, she took time to acknowledge the depth of his devotion to the Queen and to express her understanding of how the mistake had occurred. She emphasized that she had never doubted his loyalty or his good intentions, and that she respected the emotional bond he had shared with her late mother-in-law. The conversation evolved into something much deeper than a simple apology and acceptance. Harrison found himself sharing memories of the Queen that he had never told anyone else, stories that revealed the more human side of the monarch and the genuine warmth of their relationship. Camilla, in turn, spoke about her own grief for the Queen and her ongoing efforts to understand and honor her legacy while finding her own place within the royal tradition. One particularly poignant moment came when Harrison described the Queen's excitement when she first received the Range Rover, how she had insisted on taking it for an immediate test drive despite the concerns of her security detail. He painted a picture of a woman who found genuine joy in simple pleasures, who valued independence and connection to the natural world above many of the formal trappings of her position. This image resonated strongly with Camilla, who had been struggling to understand exactly what the vehicle had meant to the Queen. As their conversation continued, a new understanding emerged between the two people who had been on opposite sides of the conflict. Harrison began to see Camilla not as an outsider taking liberties with the Queen's possessions, but as someone genuinely trying to connect with the woman who had become such an important figure in her life. Camilla, meanwhile, gained a deeper appreciation for the intense loyalty and love that the Queen had inspired in people like Harrison, and the responsibility that came with being entrusted with her memory. The resolution that emerged from their conversation was more organic and meaningful than anything that could have been imposed from outside. Harrison spontaneously offered to serve as Camilla's guide to the Queen's favorite driving routes, sharing the stories and memories that would help her understand what had made those journeys so special. Camilla, touched by the offer, accepted it as both a practical assistance and a symbolic healing of their relationship. William and Catherine, who had been waiting anxiously for news of the conversation, were relieved and moved by the outcome. The solution that had emerged honored both Harrison's devotion to the Queen's memory and Camilla's legitimate place within the royal family, while also fulfilling the Queen's actual wishes as revealed through Maria's testimony and the unfinished letter. The discovery of the Queen's true intentions also had broader implications for how the royal family would approach similar situations in the future. Charles announced his intention to have all of the Queen's personal papers reviewed carefully to identify any other wishes or instructions that might have been overlooked in the immediate aftermath of her death. This process would help ensure that future decisions about her possessions and legacy would be guided by her actual intentions rather than assumptions about what she might have wanted. Maria Santos found herself in an unexpectedly important position as the keeper of crucial information about the Queen's final wishes. Her decision to come forward with sensitive information had resolved a significant conflict and revealed important insights about the Queen's hopes for her family. Charles made sure that Maria's contribution was recognized and that she understood how valuable her knowledge would continue to be as the family worked to honor the Queen's memory appropriately. The Range Rover itself seemed to take on a different character in light of these revelations. What had been a source of conflict and confusion was now understood as a deliberate gift, a bridge between the Queen's past and Camilla's future, a tangible expression of welcome and inclusion. The vehicle remained the same, but its meaning had been completely transformed by the discovery of the Queen's true intentions. As the fourth day drew to a close, everyone involved in the conflict felt a sense of resolution and, perhaps more importantly, a deeper understanding of the complex relationships and emotions that defined life within the royal household. The crisis had been painful for everyone involved, but it had also revealed truths about loyalty, love, and the importance of communication that would serve the family well in facing future challenges. The successful resolution of the Range Rover incident would become a model for handling similar conflicts, demonstrating the value of patience, open communication, and careful investigation before drawing conclusions about people's motives or actions. Most importantly, it had shown how seemingly impossible conflicts could be transformed into opportunities for deeper understanding and stronger relationships when approached with genuine care for all parties involved. The fifth day dawned with a sense of anticipation and hope that had been absent from Balmoral Castle since the Range Rover incident began. The revelations of the previous day had fundamentally changed everyone's understanding of the situation, and now the focus shifted to implementing the healing that had begun between Sergeant Major Harrison and Queen Consort Camilla. What emerged would be far more meaningful and lasting than anyone could have imagined when the conflict first erupted. Harrison arrived at the castle's main entrance precisely at 9 o'clock, dressed in his civilian clothes rather than his usual uniform, a subtle but significant gesture that signaled his approach to the day's activities. He carried with him a leather portfolio that had belonged to the late Queen, filled with maps, photographs, and handwritten notes that documented her favorite routes and destinations throughout the Balmoral estate and the surrounding countryside. Camilla met him at the entrance wearing practical clothing suitable for Highland driving, including a barber jacket that had actually belonged to the Queen and had been given to her as a gift during the early years of her marriage to Charles. The symbolism of wearing the Queen's jacket while embarking on this journey was not lost on either of them, and it seemed to bless their expedition with a sense of continuity and connection that transcended the recent conflict. King Charles and Prince William watched from the morning room window as Harrison carefully explained the contents of his portfolio to Camilla, pointing out specific locations on detailed maps and sharing stories that brought each route to life. Their body language spoke of mutual respect and genuine collaboration, a dramatic transformation from the tension that had characterized their previous interactions. The Queen's Range Rover had been prepared with special care for this journey. The castle's maintenance staff had ensured that every system was functioning perfectly, and Maria Santos had personally cleaned and organized the interior, making sure that the Queen's personal touches remained exactly as she had left them. The vehicle gleamed in the morning sunlight, looking every bit as magnificent as it had during the Queen's lifetime. Before beginning their drive, Harrison and Camilla paused for a moment of quiet reflection beside the Range Rover. Harrison shared one final story about the Queen's relationship with the vehicle, describing how she had always insisted on checking the oil and tire pressure herself before longer journeys, a habit that amused and sometimes frustrated her security detail, but that reflected her practical nature and genuine love for the mechanical aspects of driving. Their first destination was a remote glen that the Queen had discovered early in her ownership of the Range Rover, a place where she could park and walk to a viewpoint that offered sweeping vistas across the estate and into the distance toward the Cairngorms. Harrison explained that this had been one of her favorite spots for quiet contemplation, especially during difficult periods when the pressures of royal duty seemed overwhelming. As they drove through the highland landscape, Harrison shared memories and observations that helped Camilla understand not just the geography of the estate, but the emotional landscape that it had represented for the Queen. He described how different seasons brought different moods to the same locations, how morning light transformed familiar views into something magical, and how the Queen had developed personal relationships with specific landmarks and natural features. The conversation that unfolded during their journey was rich with insights about the Queen's character and her deep connection to the Scottish landscape. Harrison revealed how she had often used these drives as opportunities for serious thinking about important decisions, how the rhythm of the road and the beauty of the surroundings had helped clarify her thoughts on everything from family matters to affairs of state. Camilla found herself deeply moved by these revelations, gaining a new appreciation for the complexity and depth of the woman who had been her mother-in-law. The picture that emerged was of someone who had found genuine solace and inspiration in simple pleasures, who had valued the opportunity to escape temporarily from the formal requirements of her position and connect with something more fundamental and enduring. Their second stop was at a small loch where the Queen had often paused to watch for wildlife, particularly the red deer that were abundant in the area. Harrison explained how she had become quite knowledgeable about the local ecology, developing a genuine expertise that went far beyond casual interest. Her conversations with estate managers and conservationists had been informed and substantive, reflecting her serious commitment to environmental stewardship. At this location, Camilla made a discovery that would become deeply meaningful to her. Hidden in the Range Rover's glove compartment was a small notebook in the Queen's handwriting, containing observations about wildlife sightings, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. The notebook revealed a side of the Queen that few people had known about, showing her as a careful observer of nature and a thoughtful recorder of the patterns and cycles that governed life in the Highlands. Harrison was surprised by the discovery, admitting that he had never known about the notebook despite his many journeys with the Queen. This revelation added another layer to their understanding of how personal and private these drives had been for her, how they had provided not just recreation but also intellectual stimulation and creative expression. As they continued their journey, visiting location after location that held special significance, a new tradition began to take shape. Camilla started adding her own observations to the Queen's notebook, continuing the record in a way that honored its original purpose while making it relevant to her own experience. Harrison encouraged this addition, seeing it as a perfect example of how the Queen's legacy could be preserved while also being allowed to grow and evolve. Their final destination was perhaps the most significant of all, a simple Highland bothy where the Queen had sometimes stopped for picnic lunches during longer expeditions. Harrison revealed that she had kept basic supplies there, including a kettle and tea service, and had often invited estate workers and local residents to join her for informal conversations over tea and sandwiches. The bothy had been maintained exactly as the Queen had left it, creating a time capsule that preserved not just her physical arrangements, but also the spirit of hospitality and democratic conversation that had characterized these gatherings. Harrison described how these informal meetings had been some of the Queen's favorite times, when she could interact with people as simply herself rather than as the monarch, learning about their lives and concerns in a relaxed and genuine way. Camilla was profoundly touched by this glimpse into the Queen's character, understanding more clearly than ever before the depth of her connection to the people and landscape of Scotland. The bothy represented everything that the Queen had valued: simplicity, genuine human connection, and the kind of democratic interaction that was rarely possible in her formal role. As they shared tea in the same setting where the Queen had hosted countless similar gatherings, Harrison and Camilla found their relationship transformed into something approaching friendship. The formal barriers that had defined their previous interactions dissolved in the face of shared appreciation for the Queen's memory and genuine respect for each other's perspectives and feelings. Their conversation in the bothy touched on broader themes about the nature of royal service and the challenges of preserving tradition while allowing for growth and change. Harrison found himself articulating thoughts and feelings that he had never expressed before, while Camilla shared her own struggles with understanding and fulfilling her role within the royal family. When they finally returned to Balmoral Castle in the late afternoon, both Harrison and Camilla were changed by their experience. They had discovered common ground in their love for the Queen's memory and their commitment to honoring it appropriately, but they had also developed mutual respect and understanding that would serve them well in future interactions. King Charles and Prince William were waiting for their return, eager to hear about their day and relieved to see clear evidence that the conflict had been truly resolved. The transformation in the relationship between Harrison and Camilla was obvious to everyone who saw them together, and the success of their expedition seemed to bless the entire household with a sense of peace and resolution. That evening, the royal family gathered for dinner in the same dining room where the Queen had hosted thousands of meals over the decades. The conversation was relaxed and warm, with Harrison invited to join them as a guest rather than as staff, a gesture that recognized his unique relationship with the family and his important role in preserving the Queen's memory. Harrison shared more stories from his years of service, painting a picture of the Queen as a complex and fascinating woman who had found ways to remain genuine and grounded despite the extraordinary demands of her position. These stories helped the family understand more deeply the woman they had known as mother and grandmother, adding new dimensions to their grief and their efforts to honor her legacy. Camilla announced her intention to continue the tradition of Highland drives, using the Range Rover to explore routes that Harrison would help her discover while also developing her own favorite destinations and routines. This decision was received with enthusiasm by everyone present, as it represented exactly the kind of continuity balanced with evolution that the Queen herself had hoped for. The Range Rover incident had concluded not just with resolution, but with genuine transformation and growth for everyone involved. What had begun as a painful conflict had evolved into an opportunity for deeper understanding, stronger relationships, and clearer insight into the Queen's true wishes and values. The lessons learned from the crisis would influence how the royal family approached similar challenges in the future, emphasizing the importance of communication, the value of patience in seeking understanding, and the wisdom of looking beyond immediate assumptions to discover deeper truths about people's motives and intentions. Most importantly, the incident had demonstrated that even the most difficult conflicts could be transformed into opportunities for growth and healing when approached with genuine care for all parties involved and sincere commitment to honoring the best traditions while embracing necessary change. As the evening drew to a close and the participants reflected on the journey they had all taken together, there was a sense of completion and new beginning that seemed to embody everything the Queen herself had hoped for her family and household. The Range Rover would continue to serve its intended purpose, but now it carried with it the additional meaning of reconciliation, understanding, and the successful navigation of one of the first major challenges of the new reign. The Highland landscape remained unchanged, but the people who would travel through it had been transformed by their experience, carrying forward new levels of mutual respect, deeper understanding of their shared mission, and enhanced appreciation for the complex legacy they had all inherited from one of the most remarkable women in modern history.